Hello everyone. Help us choose the new voice for the channel. If you prefer the voice used in stories 1 and 2 of this video, write voice 1 in the comments. If you like the voice used in stories 3 and 4, write voice 2. Thank you for participating. I work as a barista in a small neighborhood coffee shop, the kind of cozy spot where almost everyone knows each other. Usually, the customers are laid back, just locals grabbing a quick coffee or relaxing for a bit. That night, I was covering the closing shift, which didn't bother me much since it's usually quiet around closing time. Everything was normal until he walked in. He was tall, wearing a worn-out jacket, with messy hair and a look that didn't really focus on anything. The second he stepped in, I felt this weird chill. He wasn't someone I recognized, but that wasn't unusual. He ordered a plain black coffee, no sugar, and sat at a table in the back corner, near the window. He didn't seem to be in any rush. In fact, everything about him was slow and deliberate, from pulling out his wallet to picking up his cup. The uneasiness crept in when I noticed he wasn't on his phone, wasn't reading, not even looking out the window. His eyes seemed distant, but every now and then, I felt like he was watching me. I tried to shake it off and keep myself busy with closing tasks as the time ticked by. With about 15 minutes left before closing, I started tidying up and announced that we'd be shutting down soon. He didn't react. He just sat there completely still, staring into his empty cup. When I gave the final notice, saying it was last call before closing, he turned his head toward me, like he was just now realizing I was there. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stared. That's when I started to feel genuinely uneasy. I've had customers linger before, but this was different. There was something off about him, something I couldn't put into words. My heart started racing, but I tried to keep my composure. I repeated the announcement, saying we'd be closing in 5 minutes, but he still didn't move. That sinking feeling, like something bad was about to happen, was growing stronger by the second. I decided to be more direct. I moved closer to the counter, keeping a safe distance, and told him firmly that the store was closing and he needed to leave. That's when he finally stood up, but not to leave. Instead, he started walking toward me, slowly, dragging his feet. "I just need another minute," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. There was something unsettling about his tone, like he was trying to sound harmless, but wasn't quite pulling it off. Every step he took made the air feel heavier. I froze for a moment, but as he got closer, I instinctively backed away, putting the counter between us as if it could actually protect me. When he stopped on the other side of the counter, his gaze felt even more empty, yet somehow threatening. I tried to keep my voice steady as I repeated that we were closing and he had to leave. My heart was pounding, and I started regretting not locking the door as soon as the last customer walked out. He gave me this faint, creepy smile, but didn't say anything. Instead, he placed his hands on the counter and leaned in slightly, like he was trying to close the gap between us. I took another step back, feeling panic rising in my chest. My mind was racing. What could I do? We were alone, and the cafe was small. I made my way to the kitchen door, trying to put more distance between us. He started moving slowly along the counter, almost like he was studying me. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As soon as I raised the phone to my ear, he noticed and froze. "You don't need to do that," he said, his voice calm, but it sent chills down my spine. His calmness didn't last long. When he realized I wasn't lowering the phone, his expression shifted. That eerie smile disappeared, and his empty look turned into something angry, almost unhinged. He moved faster this time, heading toward me, and I bolted into the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing as I tried to explain what was happening to the dispatcher on the other end of the line. I could hear his heavy footsteps on the other side of the door, and then the sound of him jiggling the doorknob. My stomach dropped when I remembered that the kitchen lock wasn't very strong. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a knife from the rack near the sink. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped it. Then I heard a loud bang as he started kicking the door, and my mind went into full survival mode. The dispatcher told me officers were on their way, but it felt like time had completely stopped. Every kick against the door made it rattle, and I was convinced it was going to give in at any moment. I started screaming, not to him, but in desperation, hoping maybe someone outside would hear me. The banging suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. I gripped the knife tighter, trying to steady my breathing, but I couldn't move. I heard his footsteps retreating, but I wasn't sure if he was really leaving or just trying to trick me. I stayed frozen in the corner of the kitchen, straining to hear any sound that would give me a clue about what he was doing. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the front door chime like someone opening or closing it. My heart sank. Had he left, or was he trying to lure me out? A few minutes later, the flashing lights of police cars lit up the small kitchen window. Relief washed over me, but I still didn't feel safe enough to move. I waited until I heard voices outside before unlocking the door. When I finally opened it, two officers were standing in the cafe, moving cautiously. I explained everything, my hands still shaking, as they searched the place, but he was gone. The front door was unlocked, and it looked like he had just walked out calmly as if nothing had happened. That realization hit me like a brick. He could be anywhere. After the officers finished their search, they assured me they'd patrol the area for the rest of the night, but there wasn't much else they could do. Probably just someone trying to scare you, one of them said, like that would make me feel better. But it didn't feel like he was just trying to scare me. The way he moved, slow and deliberate, and the way he stared, it felt like he had a plan, and I had barely escaped. I thanked them, but deep down, I knew they didn't really get how serious it felt. That night, I couldn't sleep. His face, that hollow smile, and those eyes that never left me were burned into my memory. I spent hours replaying everything in my head, wondering what could have happened if he had broken through that door. The next day, I asked my boss to never schedule me to close the cafe alone again. Even now, I avoid working late shifts and keep an eye on every customer who comes in near closing time. He never came back, but the fear he left behind still lingers. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, and I'll probably never find out, but I'll never forget that night. I work as the manager of a 24-hour diner in a small town. I've always considered myself a pretty laid-back guy, but there's one night I can't stop thinking about. It still makes me nervous. I'm 34, and the night shifts are usually uneventful, almost boring. The only thing that stood out was this one guy who showed up every single night at exactly 9 p.m. He wasn't creepy, just methodical. He always picked the same booth in the corner by the window, ordered a black coffee, and spent his time scribbling in a notebook. He barely spoke to anyone, just the basics to order and pay for his coffee. At first, I thought he might be a writer or some kind of artist with a weird routine. But after weeks of the same exact behavior, I started noticing something that didn't sit right. He never interacted with anyone, barely looked up from that notebook, and seemed weirdly attached to that one specific booth. Honestly, I was curious, but I kept my distance and stuck to polite small talk. That night, everything seemed normal until I realized something was off. He didn't show up at 9. I thought it was strange, but I didn't overthink it. Everyone has their off days, right? But as the night went on, I started feeling uneasy. It was like the absence of his routine left this weird void. I kept glancing at his booth, half expecting him to just walk in like always, but he never did. The shift was quiet, but I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. By midnight, I started closing up the diner. I turned off the lights and locked the doors when I noticed something through the glass door. A car was parked in the lot, headlights off. It's not unusual for someone to wait in the parking lot, but something about that car gave me chills. I looked closer and recognized the driver. It was him. My heart started racing, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or he was waiting for someone. But as I kept watching, he opened the car door and stepped out. He didn't look like he was just stretching his legs or about to leave. He started walking toward the diner, his steps slow but deliberate. I didn't know what to think. The street was completely empty, and the only sound I could hear was the echo of his footsteps on the pavement. I tried to stay rational, but something about the way he looked at the diner made every instinct in me scream that something was wrong. He wasn't the quiet customer I had seen every night. There was something different about him, something unsettling. When he reached the door, I froze for a few seconds before rushing to make sure everything was locked. I heard the door handle jiggle, and then a loud thud, like he was trying to force it open. I was sweating bullets at this point. He started knocking on the door, lightly at first, like he was trying to get my attention. But the knocks quickly turned into loud, aggressive banging. Each hit echoed through the dark, empty diner, and my sense of panic only grew stronger. My phone was on the counter, so while he kept trying the door, I bolted to grab it and call the police. My hands were shaking so badly it took me a few tries to dial the number. As I explained the situation to the dispatcher, he began walking around the outside, peering through the windows. He was holding his notebook in one hand like it was some kind of sacred object. At one point, he pressed his face right up against the glass, trying to spot me inside. I ducked behind the counter, barely breathing, while the dispatcher told me to stay calm and wait for the police to arrive. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. He started banging on the windows now, trying different spots around the diner. He never said a word, which made it even more disturbing. Just as I was starting to lose it, I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me for a second, but then I noticed something. He had heard them too. He suddenly stopped what he was doing and stood still, staring in the direction of the parking lot as if deciding his next move. Out of nowhere, he bolted back to his car, got in, and sped off with his headlights still off. When the police arrived, I tried explaining what had happened, but I felt like an idiot rambling about a weird customer acting strange. The officers were polite, but I could tell they weren't taking it as seriously as I was. They did a quick sweep of the lot and told me the car was probably long gone by then. After they left, I was alone in the diner, trying to process everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Sure, he hadn't broken anything or made any direct threats, but the way he acted, how determined and off he seemed, it really rattled me. I locked up as fast as I could and headed straight home, still shaking from the whole ordeal. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Would he come back? Was it personal, or was he just someone completely unhinged? The strangest part is that I never saw him again. He vanished just as suddenly as he appeared. But to this day, whenever I'm closing up and see a car sitting in the parking lot for too long, my heart starts pounding, and I can't help but wonder if it's him.
Working the night shift had always been manageable for me, even if it was exhausting. Most of the customers were truck drivers, partygoers stopping by for a late meal, or couples grabbing a quick bite. It was a routine that, while tiring, rarely brought any surprises. That night felt no different. I was cleaning a table near the counter when a man walked in. He didn't seem unusual, wearing a baseball cap and plain clothes, looking tired. He sat in one of the corner booths and ordered coffee with apple pie, just your typical late-night customer. But when he paid his bill, he left something that made my stomach drop, a generous tip, way bigger than usual, with a folded note next to it. When I opened it, it read, "I want to get to know you better." The handwriting was sloppy, rushed, like he didn't want anyone noticing. I tried to stay calm and followed the unwritten rule of any customer service job. Smile and be polite. I thanked him for the tip but didn't say a word about the note. He just smiled in this strange way, like he knew I had read it. After he left, I brought the note over to my coworkers at the counter. They laughed it off, saying it was probably just some awkward attempt at flirting or someone trying to be funny. But I couldn't laugh. There was something about the way he watched me, waiting for my reaction, that felt off. Maybe I was just being paranoid, I thought. I took a deep breath, tossed the note in the trash, and went back to work, trying to shake it off. The rest of the night went by without any issues, but I couldn't stop thinking about that note. Every time the bell above the door jingled, I found myself glancing over, half expecting him to come back. But he didn't. When my shift finally ended, it was close to 3 a.m. The diner was practically empty, and I was ready to head home, take a shower, and forget about the whole thing. I said goodbye to my coworkers and walked to the parking lot, trying not to let my imagination get the better of me. The air was cold, and the stillness of the early morning made every sound seem louder. That's when I noticed it. A car parked across the street. It didn't belong to any of my coworkers, and I was sure I'd never seen it there before. The car looked like it was off, but I could feel someone inside, watching me. For a second, I thought about going back into the diner and asking one of my coworkers to walk me to my car, but I felt silly. It's probably just a coincidence, I told myself, trying to push the thought away. I got into my car quickly, locked the doors, and started the engine. But as I pulled out onto the road, I noticed the headlights behind me. The car didn't speed past me or flash its lights, It just followed me, keeping the same distance. My heart was racing, and every mile felt like it stretched on forever. As I kept driving, my heart was pounding harder with every turn. I tried convincing myself it was nothing, that the car just happened to be going the same way, but it was hard to ignore. Every time I slowed down, the car did the same. When I took a random turn onto a side street just to test it, the car followed. My breathing got heavier, and my hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. There was no doubt about it. This car was following me. I thought about stopping somewhere busy, but it was too late. The streets were empty, and every store or gas station had already closed. Each glance at the rearview mirror made the headlights seem closer. When I finally turned onto my street, I felt torn. Part of me thought it would be safer not to go home, but the other part just wanted to be behind a locked door. I sped the last few blocks, parked haphazardly in my driveway, and bolted inside, locking every single latch behind me. My breathing was so erratic I had to lean against the wall to steady myself. I rushed upstairs to peek through the curtain, and there it was. The car was parked on the curb, its headlights off, but I could still see it under the faint glow of the streetlight. My stomach dropped. What did they want? Why were they here? I backed away from the window, shaking, and grabbed my phone. I called the police, trying to explain what was happening, but my voice felt shaky and weak. The dispatcher assured me that they'd send a patrol car and told me to stay inside. Stay calm. How could I? Someone was out there, watching my house. The silence of the house felt suffocating. I wanted to look out the window again, but fear held me back. What if they saw me looking? What if that was exactly what they wanted? Waiting for the police felt like forever. I sat in the dark living room, straining to hear any sound from outside. Then, I heard it, the low hum of an engine starting. I ran back to the window and saw the car slowly pulling away, turned the corner at the end of the street and disappeared into the night. My mind was racing. They knew where I lived. They could come back. Were they just trying to scare me now, or was something worse coming? When the police finally arrived, I told them everything, but there wasn't much they could do. They drove around the neighborhood but didn't find anything. One of the officers suggested installing security cameras, but beyond that, there wasn't much advice they could give. After the police left, I sat on the couch for hours, still trembling. The silence of the early morning felt heavier than ever, like something could happen at any second, but nothing did. The car didn't come back and the street stayed eerily quiet. When the sun finally started rising, I felt a small sense of relief, but the fear hadn't fully gone away. I didn't sleep that night, and for the next few days I struggled to even leave the house. Every time a customer at the diner gave me an odd look, I thought back to that note, that unsettling smile, and the feeling of being followed. To this day, I still don't know who that man was or why he followed me. Maybe it was just a bizarre coincidence, but it never felt like that. I never saw him again, but for weeks, I lived in constant paranoia, checking over my shoulder wherever I went. I installed cameras at home, just like the police recommended, and even started changing up my routine, parking in different spots and leaving work at different times. But even now, when I'm driving home at night, I sometimes feel that same sense of dread. I glance in my rearview mirror more times than I should, and on some nights, I lie awake, wondering if that car might show up again. I work as a cook at a 24-hour diner, and my shift usually starts at 6 p.m. and goes until the early hours of the morning. It's not unusual for me to be the last one left, closing up the place on my own. Last night was one of those nights. It was around 2 a.m. and I was in the storage room, organizing supplies like I always do before ending my shift. Everything seemed normal, just the heavy silence you get when you're alone in a big place like that. While I was checking inventory, I started hearing noises coming from the kitchen. It sounded like something metal being dragged. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or maybe a loose pan slipping off its spot. Still, It made me uneasy because I was sure everything was clean and in place before I went to the storage room. I tried to ignore it and kept working, but the noises didn't stop. I could hear faint footsteps and then something clattering onto the floor. I decided to head back to the kitchen, thinking maybe I was just overreacting from being tired, but as soon as I opened the storage room door, a strange smell hit me. It was like something was cooking, or maybe burning on the stove. When I stepped into the kitchen, my stomach dropped. Pots were scattered on the counters and even on the floor. A bag of flour, which I had definitely put away, was open with flour spilled everywhere. And the stove, one of the burners was on, with a pan sitting on it. None of it made sense. I had left everything spotless and turned off. My first thought was that someone was messing with me. A coworker who came back for something and decided to pull a prank. Very funny, I muttered to myself as I turned off the stove and started cleaning up. But then it hit me. How would they have even gotten in? The front door was locked, and I was the only one with the keys. That's when I noticed the back door, the one that opens to the alley. It was slightly ajar. My heart started racing as I walked toward the back door. I was sure I had locked it earlier when the delivery guys left, but now it was wide open. I peeked outside, trying to see if anyone was still around, but the alley was empty, dimly lit by a flickering streetlight. I stepped back inside and locked the door immediately, but the uneasy feeling stuck with me. Something was definitely off, and the idea that someone might still be nearby gave me chills. I decided to check the security cameras. I headed to the office where the system was set up and started reviewing the footage from the past hour. It didn't take long before I froze. A man appeared on the back door camera. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, but it was enough to hide his face. He opened the door and walked in like he owned the place, calm and unbothered. He didn't look like he was in a hurry at all. The guy walked straight to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and started pulling out ingredients. I watched as he grabbed a few pots, turned on the stove, and even warmed up something he brought in a plastic bag. He acted like he had all the time in the world, completely relaxed, while I was just a few feet away in the storage room with no idea this was happening. The weirdest part? He never looked around, like he wasn't even worried about getting caught. After a few minutes, he grabbed a bag of bread and casually walked out the back door, shutting it behind him like it was nothing. I replayed the footage a couple of times, trying to figure out how he even got in, but there was nothing unusual except the door being unlocked. It was like he knew exactly what to do and how to leave no trace. I turned off the cameras and went back to the kitchen, still trying to wrap my head around what I'd just seen. Everything was quiet now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still there. I checked every corner of the restaurant, under tables, behind counters, even in the bathroom. Nothing. The place was empty, except for the mess in the kitchen that proved someone had definitely been there. When I went back to the storage room to finish up, something else caught my eye that made my skin crawl. One of the cabinets was open, and I didn't remember leaving it like that. When I went to close it, I noticed the lock was broken, like someone had forced it open. A quick look inside confirmed it. Some bottles of alcohol and a few smaller items were missing. That's when it hit me. The guy from the video had been in the storage room too, probably just a few feet away from me while I was distracted. That was it for me. I grabbed my things and got out of there as fast as I could. Walking to my car in the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the place was completely still. Even so, I felt like he could be hiding somewhere, maybe in the shadows of the alley, just waiting. I got in my car and drove home in silence, the whole thing replaying in my head over and over. The next day, I told my manager everything. He was more annoyed about the stolen items than the fact that someone had broken in while I was there. We reviewed the footage again, but it didn't give us any new clues. The cops were called, but the guy didn't leave behind a single lead, just the footage of him calmly walking in and out. To this day, I triple-check the back door every time I close, but I can't forget how close he was that night. Close enough to take what he wanted without me even noticing.